for the November installment of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. I am Anita Marsh. I'm the membership manager here at ILA, and I'm going to be presenting to you Mary Uhl-Bien and Sonia Ospina. They will be talking about Advancing Relational Leadership Research. We're very excited to have them. Mary is the BNSF Railway Endowed Professor of Leadership and Professor of Management at Texas Christian University. And Sonia is a Professor of Public Management and Policy at the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at New York University. I just want to let you know that the webinar will be archived. If you missed something and would like to hear the webinar again or would like to see the presentation again, they will be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Next, we welcome your questions. At any time, you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second half, rather the last quarter of the webinar. Please note that we may not be able to address each question we receive. Without further ado, I'd like to present to most and introduce to others Mary Uhl-Bien and Sonia Ospina.
Thank you, Anita. This is Mary Uhl-Bien. Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to be here. I hope that it's warmer for you than it is for us in the United States. We are freezing. I moved to Texas thinking that I was getting away from the cold, but it seems to be following me down. What we're going to be talking about today is a book that Sonia and I have worked on together. It's, I would say, a labor of love for both of us. The book is called Advancing Relational Leadership Research, a Dialogue Among Perspectives. And what we're going to do is talk about our collaboration, what motivated the book, why we're excited about the book, and why you would want to get the book and the value that it has for you. So with that, I'm just going to turn straight to what the book is about and introduce Sonia and allow her to start this conversation.
Thanks, Mary. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I hope you're hearing me fine. And please, Mary, let me know if you hear an echo or anything that I need to pay attention to. I will do the same with you. Okay. So, yes, let's start by talking about what the book is about. So basically, the book tries to capture reflections and exchanges that happened between a group of prominent leadership scholars around the challenges that they and we were facing when confronted in the work with this idea of leadership as something that is relational. But the book itself actually is an attempt to bring together scholars that have very different perspectives about what relational leadership means and to try to trigger a conversation about how we think about leadership and the implications of that thinking for the choices that we make in research and obviously the choices that we make in the practice of leadership. To be able to appreciate the importance of this conversation, we need to actually step back for a moment and think about the idea of relationality itself. Because when this idea entered the leadership studies field, it sort of revolutionized some of the key assumptions, and in some way it transforms notions of what the leader is, what the follower is, what the relationship between them is, and this has consequences for how people do their research, and also we believe it has consequences for how people practice leadership. So what is relationality? It's the understanding that as human beings, we are relational beings. What this means is that we're not independent of other human beings, but we exist in relationship. We exist because we participate in relationships. That means that we become who we are because of the multiple relationships that intersect in our past. And we both shape those relationships, but we are also shaped by those relationships. Gergen, who's a scholar on relationality, says, in whatever we think, remember, create, and feel, we participate in relationship. The bottom line is that rather than being independent beings, we are interdependent at our core. And what this means for leadership is that the leader-follower relationship must be understood, and we believe also practiced, with an understanding that this relationship occurs in a complex web of relationships and that is bigger than the leader-follower relationship and in contexts that are very dynamic. If we take this idea seriously, then we must revise some of the basic assumptions that we have about leadership theories as they have existed so far. On the one hand, conventional theories of leadership tend to assume that the leader and the follower act independent of one another. So the leader influences the follower, and then maybe the follower influences back the leader. And the more contemporary theories understand that there is a give-and-take relationship. However, what is different when we think about this from a relationality perspective is that the leader and the follower are not separate entities. They, in fact, only become leader and follower in the context of the relationship that defines them as leader and follower. So what this means is very important in terms of thinking about research and practice. But leadership scholars who focus on the leader-follower relationship, many of them still believe that people exist independent of the relationships. That, on the other hand, the new perspective focuses on thinking of leaders and followers as not existing before the relationship exists. And so this kind of is counterintuitive. And so there is a sort of a clash in terms of the basic assumptions that scholars who take the entity perspective have and scholars who take this perspective where leadership is constructed have. So the book is about what happens to our theories and to our research when we try to bring into the picture this idea that leadership is relational. And we basically, for this book, invited leadership scholars who had different understandings of what it meant, what relationality meant for leadership, to try to see if we could come up with some sort of agreement about the implication of relationality for the leadership studies field. You might wonder why we were motivated to do this book ourselves. And so we should talk about what motivated this book a little bit.
So as I listen to Sonia, I am sitting here smiling. I'm kind of missing our collaboration, Sonia. I think I need another dose. It's been a couple of years since we've worked together. But I'm smiling because you can hear her sociological background come in. So Sonia is trained as a sociologist. My training is more from the psychology side. I'm trained in the business school, but I was trained by an IO psychologist. So what motivated this book for me was that I thought I was a relational researcher. So in the 1990s, I was working on leader-member exchange research, and I was beginning to realize that the theory that I was working on was very limited, that it didn't have real application for practice, at least not on a level that offered much beyond some very limited information. So what I could tell people in my classroom was you need to develop good relationships with your manager, with your subordinate, but that's not really the world that they live in. There's so much more to it when you think about leadership and context. So I was beginning to understand that I needed to have a better understanding of context. And then I went and I started reading. I thought I was having all of these brilliant ideas, and I went and I started reading the leadership research, and I came across Diane Marie Hosking's work in the late 1980s. So this was around 2000. And here I am thinking I'm having brilliant insights, and of course somebody has said it, or said it before me and said it much better than I did. So I was reading Diane Marie's work, and then I started to think to myself, my gosh, there's a whole other world out there of research that I wasn't even aware of. And to be quite honest with you, I was a bit angry about that, because here I was trained in what I thought was relational leadership, and I thought I was a relational leadership expert, but as it turned out, I had no understanding of this other side of the field, and not only was I not aware of it and not understanding it, I couldn't understand it if I tried. So I really needed to reach out to other people to try to see what was happening. I wasn't trained in anything to do with philosophy of science. I didn't know that I was a post-positivist. I didn't know there was this thing called constructionism. So I was really struggling. So I wrote a paper in 2006, I think it was now, that talked about this, and I was trying to review the relational leadership field from both paradigms. And after I did that, I got a call from Sonia. Sonia and I had met because we were working on the network of leadership scholars. Sonia said, gosh, I wish I'd written that book or that article. And then we started talking, and I said, well, I want to do a book, but I don't have time to do it. So we agreed to do this book together. So that was how I got into this and what motivated it from my side.
Yeah, it's interesting because unlike Mary, I wasn't trained on OB or leadership studies. I really wasn't a leadership scholar at that point, but there was this interesting grant that where we were going to be looking at leadership in the context of civil society organizations or organizations that were trying to do social change. And so I had to understand this idea of leadership if I was going to contribute to it. So I started thinking about leadership in the middle of my career as a sociologist, and of course I brought my sociological lenses and I started to read the literature. And I was less interested in the social psychology or behavior perspectives, but I couldn't find any empirical work on leadership in the sociology literature either. So I started to look and dig deeper, and I found a couple of articles in sociology that talked about the social construction of leadership. The idea that the group of people co-create their leadership out of agreements about the need to do a particular piece of work together, and that it is the making sense, making meaning out of trying to do this collective work that leadership emerges and becomes the reality that it is. So that intrigued me, and I said, okay, that's going to be my framework. I'm going to enter the leadership studies field through that framework, and obviously this was a constructionist approach to leadership that is from the very beginning based on the assumption of relationality. So from the beginning, as I tried to figure out a research design about how to look at leadership in the context of these civil societies, I was guided by the principles of relationality in the tradition of social construction of reality, which is there a sociological tradition that I could understand. What I didn't realize was that I was entering a field that had kinds of fault lines, like geological divides and fractures that were very hard to see from the outside but had real consequences. So for example, by the time we started having findings on our research, I was working with a team of colleagues from the Wagner School at NYU, I suddenly realized that I had entered a field through a lens and a theoretical approach that was very different from the OB approach, and that in fact the colleagues from OB thought of it as less scientific. There were very few sociologists working on this. So I actually realized that I wanted to talk to leadership scholars, but they weren't going to pay a lot of attention to me because I wasn't talking in the language of post-positivism, which is the one where most OB scholars are trained and from where they do their leadership research. So I was kind of like struggling with this when I found Mary in this Academy of Management symposium. I heard her speak, and I said, I have to connect with her. I have to engage her in conversation. And then I went and read her 2006 piece on the Leadership Quarterly, and I said, oh my God, this is exactly where I am. Of course, I was a little disappointed because she didn't cite my work. And I had started to do some publishing, but the silos between the public management and traditional management scholarship are also big. And I also have to say, I didn't cite her work in the 2006 piece that I wrote with my colleague Georgia Sorensen about the constructionist approach to leadership, which came up the same year. So here we have these two scholars from these two different perspectives trying to think about the same issues, not citing each other, and working in two completely separate domains, and trying to do the same thing, and actually not knowing that they could do, that they should be engaged in conversation. And so when we spoke and started to think about and tell each other what we were doing, and we realized how interesting it was to speak across our divide, and we realized that we were into something here that was very important, and that perhaps we could share with a larger group of people. So let me tell you a bit about how we proceeded with the book so that you get a sense of how the book itself was a relational process. So it was we were using this relational leadership approach to actually also develop the book. So we started by identifying scholars who we knew were doing very interesting work and were addressing these issues of relationality. We sent a call for proposals. We wanted to make sure that we had people that represented both sides, Mary's side and my side, and kind of like those people who were starting to get to that middle place where we were both overlapping. And we asked them to write something about the challenges that they faced when thinking about the idea of relational leadership and how they used it in their work. So we also asked 6 of these scholars if they would agree to form pairs, one from each perspective, and read pieces of the book and engage in dialogue themselves, and then put their insights in writing in whatever form they wanted to do, to put it out there so that we could share it with everyone. So then we waited to get the material, and Mary and I went to work by reading everything that we received. We organized it into 2 different groups. There were papers that talked about the theoretical challenges, so things connected to what we think leadership is. And then there were other papers talking about the methodological challenges, so things connected to how do we do research using this relationality idea. Then we asked each of our dialogue pairs to read the papers in each section and to do their dialogue. So we had David Day and Bill Drass, and we asked them to read the theory papers and to engage in conversation. And then we asked Gail Fairhurst and John Antonakis to read the methods papers. And then we asked Boaz Shamir and Diane Marie Hoskins to read the entire book and engage in dialogue also. So there are chapters in the book that literally reflect what happened in these dialogues, with lots of amazing insights and moments that are very fun to read. For example, David and Bill resorted to humor as they tried to struggle with discussions that we suspect made them a bit uncomfortable as colleagues, as they were trying to challenge each other's assumptions or understand each other's assumptions, as one was coming more from the entity perspective and the other one was coming more from the constructionist perspective. And so as Mary and I tried to make sense of this entire set of entries, we sort of got stuck because the papers were all over the place. And we didn't want the book to just be a bunch of papers about these different perspectives put together in this collection. We wanted to make a strong point about the need for this crossover dialogue that she and I had had and that we had invited these other scholars to have. And we kind of like didn't know how to do that. So Mary, do you want to keep going with the story?
Yeah, so I think there were many interesting things that happened at this point. When we started, we had no idea it would take us as long as it did. No idea at all. Sonia and I spent, I think, a couple of years. I can't remember now. It was a couple of years, right, Sonia?
Yep.
And we went back and forth. I mean, just an example of it is the title of the book. So an easy issue like the title of the book, I wanted to call it Advancing Relational Leadership Theory. And so Sonia kept saying, why are you calling it theory? And I said, if we don't call it theory, nobody's going to know what it is. And so this engaged a big dialogue among us that went on for quite a long time because Sonia was frustrated that her work wasn't being recognized. And I was saying, well, if you want it to be recognized, you have to put the word theory after it. And then everybody knows what it is. It has an identity, and people will start talking about it. And then she said, well, I don't want to do that. I don't think it is a theory. So that was fascinating in and of itself, that even a word like that is so different from the two perspectives, because in the post-positivist perspective, we would call it a theory. But Sonia, do you want to explain why you wouldn't call it theory from your perspective? And we ended up landing on Advancing Relational Leadership Research.
Yeah. Well, to start with, I was appalled to think that the only way people would listen to me was if I created an adjective before leadership and then added the word theory. That was like playing a game. And it helped me understand why there are so many adjectives before the word leadership and so many theories, many of which don't ever make it, right? And then there are a few that become like these very well-known theories like transformational leadership and et cetera, servant leadership and all the other adjectives that we know about. But from a constructionist perspective, my idea wasn't to just develop a series of, identify a series of factors that impacted on leadership or identify factors through which leadership impacted on some outcomes, some organizational outcomes, which is kind of like the traditional way of thinking about theory in the OB perspective, like theories of the middle range, where you're basically connecting variables and seeing how they relate together. But the constructionist perspective doesn't work that way. The logic is completely different. The logic is about unpacking how people experience the world and trying to figure out how the way they experience the world helps them construct and co-construct that world with others. So variables, and it's not about that. It's really about unpacking the meaning-making processes that people are doing as they are developing agreements over time that then become institutionalized, and then it becomes something called leadership. But leadership doesn't exist before people are making meaning of what they want to do. And so this idea
from our perspective, leadership exists because we define it. So we make it objective, and leadership is, and then we define it, and we proceed from there, and then treat it as something that we're going to study as a separate entity. So that's, I think, the core difference between the two perspectives. But we weren't the only ones having this problem. So I remember that Gail Fairhurst, who came from the constructionist side, and John Antonakis, who very much is focused on statistics and science, they had trouble because John was trying to get at relationality through statistics. And Gail was saying, you can't do it through statistics because your ontological unit of relationship or relational does not match your analytical unit when you ask somebody to provide a summary measure of a relationship. And they could not really get past that. They struggled. It got very tense. With Dave Day and Bill Drass, Dave came at it. Again, he's an IO psychologist. Bill was at CCL, and he was coming from a strong relational theory perspective. And so Dave, I remember Dave using the word pizzled. He said, I saw a TED Talk recently, and it's a combination of pissed off and puzzled. So that's how their dialogue went, was Dave was pissed off and puzzled because he was perceiving this as dismissing the individual. And Bill was trying to argue for a strong relational approach, which means very much the constructionist kind of approach that Sonia's talking about, which we'll talk about when we get to the end, because I think this is an important issue that we resolved around how constructionist treats the individual. And then Lois read the book, and he was supposed to engage with Diane Marie, and as you'll see in the book, if you look at it, he wrote and said, I'm sorry, I can't even write a paper with her. I'm going to write my own. So that then sparked a whole other set of emails and conversations that Sonia had the great idea of putting in the book. So we took that and we crafted those emails and the dialogue that occurred on the side as another chapter in the book so that you could see the tensions that arose in this process. Between Mary and I, we were trying to understand this from the standpoint of mapping the terrain. So you can talk about that, Sonia.
Yeah. So, but before that, I think we need to, I want to bring a metaphor that I think is very illustrative, because this idea of the two perspectives is both theoretical and methodological, right? And so there is this interesting metaphor that people who do post-positive work think of understanding the world and looking at the world as if they had a window in front of them, and to look outside the world and understand it, they have to clean all the smudges that are in the window and try to reproduce in the most exact way what's out there in the world. But so the image, the metaphor is it's a window that you are trying to trespass to get to reality. The metaphor for constructionism is a lantern. It's about there's a cavern that's dark where there are many things happening, and all you can do is put the lantern in a corner and illuminate what's happening in that corner in that particular context, and see that as an understanding of what's going on, at least in that part of the world, and which reflects kind of like what is going on as part of the human condition. And so, you know, a window is a very different instrument and a very different theoretical lens than a lantern is. And I think that even with those two metaphors, you see the problems and the conflicts that get created and the frustrations that get created. And that's why until we got the notion of paradigm interplay, we didn't know what to do with all the struggles and things that we were finding in the book. And so, Mary, perhaps you want to talk about that before I map the terrain, right?
Yes. So Sonia and I were trying to understand the differences between us and she was teaching me a lot. I really am grateful to her because given that I was trained by a psychologist and I had no clue what philosophy of science was or even what a paradigmatic perspective was, Sonia really walked me through all of that to help me understand it because I couldn't read words like realism and all of these other things that were in that literature and understand them. But what we found when we did this book and we engaged the dialogue was, oh my gosh, did we open a can of worms. So what I'm describing with all of these challenges and issues that occurred, we were really stuck, and I was supposed to take the lead on writing the final chapter, and Sonia had so much patience with me. I don't know how long this took me, 1.5 years, I think, of processing on it, and she kept saying, we got to get that chapter done, and I kept thinking, I don't know what it is, because I said to her, we can't leave this a mess. The problem was once we opened the can of worms and we started to see all the challenges and the tensions and the conflict, we couldn't leave it at that point because if we did, we were doing a disservice to the field. It would have continued to leave a divide. So it was our job at this point to figure out how to get through bridging the divide. And so then I saw, I don't remember what year it was now, but I remember it was February of that year as I was working on the conclusion, an article in, I think it was in Research Methods, that was talking about paradigm interplay. And once I saw that article, I knew we had the answer. So Sonia and I talked, and I said, we need to think about how we could use paradigm interplay. So that became another tool for us to process the information. And essentially what we did was we used the information in the book as data. And so we took the data, we pulled it out, we identified 3 different paradigm interplays, which we'll talk about as we go through the rest of the slides. And then using those data, we looked to see what each perspective and each of the scholars had to say about that particular topic. So that was the way we put the worms back in the can and tried to come to some closure in terms of a way that we could move forward. So paradigm interplay, it's defined by Romani et al. As a respectful interaction between different paradigmatic analyses. It maintains distinctions while acknowledging connections among research paradigms. And our goal is to, sorry, I can't see this because this control panel is in the way. Oh, our goal is to build more accommodating understandings by engaging ideas across perspectives. So this became important to me because one of the things that Boas said to me is, are you trying to make everybody happy and bring everything together? And that's pretty idealistic and not really going to work. And so I was dealing with that tension that he had injected and realizing that that wasn't the right way. It wasn't that it was combining these two things. It was taking the best of each perspective and it having dialogue so that what we can do is we can maintain the unique expertise and the unique perspectives that we bring, but those are only good if we're able to engage across them. So the idea in relational leadership is that it can be an umbrella concept that can bring people from different paradigms together under the quest to understand relationality, and then we can have dialogue from those different perspectives. So Sonia, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, so one metaphor that can be helpful to understand the idea of paradigm interplay is if you think about translation and language and speaking different languages, where a paradigm, that being the perspective that looked at leadership as a construction, or the perspective that look at leadership as leaders and followers in relationship, those two are completely different in terms of the assumptions and the metaphors and the logic that is being used on each of them. In the same way that when you're speaking English or you're speaking French, there are all series of cultural assumptions and all kinds of logics that are specific to that language. But when you do translation, what you have to do is not to start just immediately speaking the other language and forget about yours. You have to bring in the meanings of the other language into and put them next to the meanings in your language, and then you can make the transition, and then you can start engaging in conversation. So it's about this meaning making and about making translations without losing what you have gained from having your own language and being in your own world, right? And so it's not about let's get some consensus. It's not even about let's find the areas of agreement and forget about the areas of disagreement. It's really about let us each other understand the other's language, and for that we need to understand the other's logic, and let's respect those assumptions and logics as being legitimate. But now let's think about what are the insights that come from that logic, and let's draw from those insights, bring them into our logic, and use it within our logic. Because what is happening right now, or what was happening since, was that there wasn't a conversation between the two logics, right? And so that's the notion of paradigm interplay. And as soon as that came and clicked, we realized actually what we have, when we started mapping the terrain of our book, what we had was a group of scholars who kind of like fell within a continuum between these two extreme versions of the paradigm, right? So a big insight that we had as we were trying to mapping the terrain was to realize that the divide was less a split with very strong boundaries and more a continuum where there were the two extremes. That very few people actually endorsed the two extremes, but the two extremes were very helpful to understand the logic. So the two extremes, if you look at the map that's in the screen, are at the left side extreme are those who view leader-follower relationship as constituted by two independent actors. So leadership is about individuals in relation, right? In this case, individuals are separate entities who exist on their own. Leaders and followers exist first, and then they engage in relationship. This is the entity perspective, and we call it the entity perspective following actually a whole tradition before us, because they view individuals as entities that stand on their own, right? In the other extreme, at the right-hand side, you have the leader-follower relationship as something that is constructed through interaction, and so it's a collective process. And the leader cannot be understood without the follower, and the follower cannot be understood without the leader. And so, in fact, they constitute one another in relationship. So in this view, the relationship comes first, and then the leaders and followers emerge second. And this is the constructionist perspective. So along this continuum from one extreme to the other, most leadership scholars fit somewhere in between that continuum. People in the left side of the graphic tend to privilege the individual dimensions of leadership because of this idea that individuals are entities and then they engage in a relationship, right? People who are in the right side of the graphic tend to privilege the collective dimensions of leadership. And the graph shows you where the scholars who answered our call to be part of the book fit within this continuum. And you will notice there are some people in the middle who explicitly say that they believe that you have to pay attention to both dimensions and that in their work they're trying to pay attention to those dimensions. But there are also people who are a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right who of course understand that there are individuals and collective dimensions, but who privilege more one than the other and therefore pay more attention to one or the other. The other thing I would say about this map is the people in bold are the dialogue scholars and the editors, and the others are all the other contributors for the book. And the last thing I'll say about this map is if you look at the upper part of the map, it refers to the underlying philosophical assumptions that guide the scholar's understanding of leadership. From a more modernist stance, the entity perspective that privileges individual dimensions and that kind of like use the window as a metaphor of science, all the way to the other side, the postmodernist stance, the constructionist perspective that privileges the collective dimensions and that uses the lantern as the primary mode of doing science. And so what we did in the book is unpack all the assumptions of the two sides and look for ways to connect those assumptions and also in the differences without having to give up the assumptions for anyone.
And so what I would say is you can see why I was motivated to do this book, because I'm smack dab in the middle. So what was happening in my case was I started on the left in the entity side, and that was what all of my colleagues, that's what they were doing. That was my whole academic group and the circles that I ran in. But when I was starting to read about work like Diane Marie Hosking and Bill Draft, I wasn't understanding it. And so I knew that I was moving away from the entity perspective. But the interesting thing was that for years I kept saying to Sonia, well, what am I? What am I? I didn't know what I was because I wasn't entity and I wasn't constructionist. So I really was something very different, and it was disconcerting because I felt like I didn't have a group. I didn't have a home or a family. And then I realized that I was in the middle, and frankly, this is why I like the complexity work, because what I found in complexity that I like is that it allows me to understand the collective and the collective dynamics, but also retain the individual, because complexity recognizes that it's agents acting in context. So I really am very, very much in the middle. I mean, I can go to the left side and go back to my entity roots. I don't think I can ever make it to the constructionist side. I'm not sure that that's where I would want to go from my own standpoint, because it's just not natural to how I think. So I really am in the middle.
Yeah,
so,
it is. Let me just say one more thing there, Mary, in response to what you just reflected, which is that, you know, I entered the field, I looked at the studies, I said, I don't want to do one more study that lists qualities or behaviors of people. I'm not going to focus on individuals. I'm just going to look at the practices and the collective processes. And I think it was a little extreme from my part, and part of what the book has done for me is made me realize that I had to go back to the individual a little bit. And so in the book, I located myself much more on the right-hand side, and my work now tends to start to move more towards the middle side, even though I'm still very, very much a constructionist.
So I'll tell you very quick funny story on that. I was asked to write a paper on relational leadership by Dave Day for a handbook that he was doing. I don't think he really realized when he asked me to do relational what he was saying. I think he thought relational, meaning LMX, but from the closer up to the wall, like where Bill Shamir is. Instead, I invited Sonia on, and I said, Sonia, now what would your perspective say about the dyad? And she hesitated, and then she said, well, we would never do that. Why would I even care about that? So we had a really good chuckle over that as I was realizing that Sonia thinks on much broader levels than thinking, just like a sociologist thinks on a broader level than at that level, at more micro level. Okay, so what were our major discoveries? We mentioned that in the concluding chapter we did the paradigm interplay. So we got our heads together and said, okay, what paradigm interplays do we see that occurred in this book? And we came up with 3. And these might not look like they're very compelling, but they really very much are. So what's compelling about them, in particular the first 2, is that what we found when we looked across the book is that everybody agreed that leadership is co-constructed. So even the entity side agreed, and everybody agreed that it's a relational process. And we believe this is a huge step forward for the field, because in the past, leadership was leaders, and it was individuals. And what people are saying is, yes, we understand that it's co-constructed or co-created. We also understand that it's a relational process, and we need to start studying that better. Now, true, many people stuck to their entity roots, and they did it more in a variable-based approach using boxes and arrows, but that's their training, that's their approach. The constructionists, true to their training, did it more from a pure context, pure social construction perspective, not really recognizing individuals. And so we still see the differences, but at least everybody agrees. And our hope for where work will go in the future is that people will take these concepts seriously, because if they do, it can really advance our field. So the third one is that leadership canon should be developed, and we needed to put that one in there to, again, say that leadership development is an important area for us to focus on. So Sonia, do you want to comment on this one at all?
Yeah, no, just very briefly on the last one about leadership development. It was interesting that as we were struggling with the discussion that David and Bill were having around this, we realized that they were talking across each other, because both were talking about leadership development, but they were using different words for them. And so very nicely in the last chapter, we actually distinguished 3 different ways of thinking about leadership development. One about the personal development, the other one about interpersonal development, which some people would say, well, that's relational. And yes, it is relational, but it's not enough relational. The third is organizational development of leadership. So leadership as constructed, developing leadership by creating conditions in the organization for for people to be able to develop their leadership. So that's the most collective perspective. So that's an illustration of how being able to make that conversation took us to unpacking this idea of how to do leadership development.
Well, and I think what's really important about that is that that was the source of Dave being pizzled, because I think that Bill understood where Dave was coming from, which is pretty characteristic of these conversations. I find that people who come from the more constructionist side understand the entity side. They get it. They get what the assumptions are. But people coming from the entity side don't understand the constructionist side, and they don't understand the philosophy, which is why Sonia had to spend years teaching me that. So when we looked at it, we realized that Dave thought he was agreeing with Bill, but he really wasn't. And Bill was trying to explain to him the constructionist side, and Dave just wasn't getting it, because he's like, yeah, I get that it's relational. But true to psychology, Dave was still thinking very much an entity. So he had identified leader development and leadership development. He was describing leader development as developing the individual, and leadership development is developing the relational. But really what he meant was how individuals interact together, more interpersonal skills. Whereas where Bill Draft was going is that what we need to do is we need to train in the collective. So leadership development should occur in the group, in the collective, and that's what Center for Creative Leadership was starting to do, was bring groups together and train them. So it really was a very, very different perspective. All right, so what were our major discoveries? Well, first, relational leadership calls for interdisciplinary study. So we really are pushing this hard. We believe that the only way we're going to get through an advanced understanding of leadership is if we take seriously interdisciplinary partnerships and dialogues and discussions. And we also believe that advancing relational leadership research requires a commitment to this multi-paradigmatic conversation, or to paradigm interplay. I know that for Sonia and me, it was unbelievably enriching. It's changed my perspective forever. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity. And I would say I've also done it with other people. I've had a lot of interdisciplinary research partnerships that have enriched my thinking and understanding. I have a much more holistic and broader understanding of leadership than a lot of people I know, because I've engaged in this paradigm interplay. So we really believe that what the field should do is encourage more of this, that we should have be facilitating spaces for that, and Sonia did that this year. You might want to talk a little bit about that, Sonia, at NYU, where we had the collective leadership discussion. So Sonia, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, sure. Let me just say that the idea of interdisciplinary is important, because each discipline kind of like has a different commitment to this idea of relationality, and so the perspectives kind of like parallel what discipline you come from, and so it's very important to bring people from lots of different disciplines to unpack what this means. And what we did at NYU was get together a group of people who were thinking about the idea of relationality and seriously in terms of their research. We brought together 50 scholars from around the world and the United States, and we did, the workshop was called Collective Leadership Research, Fruitful Intersections or Parallel Interplay, ? And so the idea was to unpack this idea of interdisciplinarity and multi-paradigmatic interplay. And so we invited people who were from different disciplines, from different countries, and also we invited people from the humanities. And the idea was then to talk together about the different challenges that we had. We liked so much the exchange and the creation of this space that we decided we're meeting again next year in April of 2015. And in the meantime, we said we were going to stay connected. And so we've done a couple of things, like, for example, we're engaged in organizing some webinars around a particular methodology and theory, organizational discourse analysis, that Gail Fairhurst is helping us put together some training for some scholars who are interested in that. So you can see the idea of multidisciplinary and multi-paradigmatic is really a lot about creating spaces where the conversations can have and where people can respectfully disagree and unpack their own assumptions. The other two takeaways is the first, the notion that the notion of relationality is really key, and that you cannot think about the idea of more post-heroic view of leadership, one that goes beyond the heroic leadership without bringing in the theoretical lenses of relationality. And what that means actually is literally imagining the metaphor of having a pair of lenses that have these blue glasses that when you put them on, you start seeing things in a very different light than you were seeing them without putting the glasses. And so what does it mean to use relationality as a lens has become like, it's a core element, a core takeaway that we need to unpack what that means. And one of the things that comes out of that is the last point directly here in terms of major key takeaways is that if leaders and followers constitute one another in the context of doing their work together to accomplish things, then the social context in leadership research becomes really important, because it's not just the background, but it is the raw material where the interactions and negotiations happen from which leadership emerges. And so the way, once you put on your relational glasses, you can't think of context the same way we used to think about it and using it just as control variables, but you have to think about it as where things happen, and so you have to really bring it in as a very important element.
Okay, so Sonia, Anita is starting to give us some questions. So Anita, do you want to do that through chat, or are you going to join on and ask us the questions? How do you want to do that?
I will ask you the questions. The first question is, explain your understanding of constructional theory and how it applies to research.
Oh, that one's for you, Sonia. What? Constructionist theory. So that's for you, Sonia. Constructionist and how it applies to research.
Well, so I'll do it by giving you an example of how we did it, right? So if you think of leadership as something that as meaning-making in communities that are trying to do something together, then you have to try to understand the work that people are doing to be able to understand how leadership is happening in that context. And notice already that the question is different. The question is not about who are the leaders, how are they contributing to what's going on, how do they influence followers. The question is, how does leadership happen in this particular context? What are the things that are going on that makes leadership emerge as a collective achievement? And that's a constructionist perspective on leadership. And so you can't go and ask people about what they think of leadership, because the people who are in the world that you're trying to understand. Because if you do that, then people are going to use the mental models they have about leadership, which are very traditional, heroic mental models, and they'll give you what you thought you were going to hear, right? So the research implications is that you have to talk about the work, you have to observe the work, you have to be there and see how people are making sense of what they're trying to do, and infer from those dynamics and the context what the work of leadership that is happening, so that people actually make sense and find the common agreements that they need to find to be able to find the commitment, to be able to find the direction, to be able to adjust to what's going on. So I'm going to stop there, but that gives you an example of how it's a different way of entering the world.
So I'm guessing that must have come from somebody from the more entity side. So let me give you the answer from the entity side, or at least a person coming from that perspective. I think it's about the idea that reality is socially constructed. And so the thing that you pick up on is that it's not just our heads. An article that I read was Ralph Stacey. He was trying to address this issue. So the core disagreement that you get is that people who come from the constructionist side don't really think about the individuals in the heads, whereas people coming from the psychology side, everything for us is about what's in our heads. And so Stacey talked about that by saying we are social through and through, that even our conversations in our heads are social. So if we're having a thought or something going on in our head, typically it's about some context or some person or some situation that we're operating in. So I think that the challenge has always been that the entity side sees constructionists as dismissing the individual, and that's just not tenable. It's a non-starter. And the constructionists try to make their point, and in doing so, I think they argue it so strongly and so vehemently that the post-positivists just turn off to them, and they say, forget it, I'm not going to listen anymore. So, Sonia, we have another question, which is, let's see, I've got to see if I can scroll here. Okay, how did you pair participants for the dialogue? Did you do that randomly, or did they already know each other? So they did already know each other. We wanted to make sure that we put it together that way, because I don't think it would have worked as well as it did, or maybe not worked at all if we did it randomly. So Boas and Diane Marie had known each other. They had a lot of respect for each other, and so they were able to engage a really healthy dialogue that engaged a lot of tension and still maintain respect. Dave Day had been at Center for Creative Leadership, so he knew Bill Drass from there. He did a sabbatical, and he and Bill he had been very influenced by Bill's thinking, which is why he wrote the article in 2000 where he was distinguishing between leader and leadership, which is the one that really got me excited, because that's where I started to see that we could move beyond the discussion of coming only out of the psychology side of the individuals. And then John and Gail had attempted to do, I think that they were working on a special issue together. I can't remember exactly, but they knew each other as well. So yeah, we could do that. Okay, so do you have another one, Anita?
I do. When you say the relational process, what's the leadership aspect? And as you think about answering that question, can you share how your work relates or differs from Barbara Kellerman, the current emphasis on combining leadership, followership, as well as methods of capturing collective dimensions of leadership?
So Sonia, you start that one again.
Mary, with the relational processes, and then I'll pick up on the capturing a little bit more.
Well, so I think that the challenge is that it's very difficult to study this from boxes and arrows. So I come out of an LMX perspective, Leader Member Exchange. And in the late 90s, when I was pulling with that and trying to figure out where I was going to go, I wasn't satisfied with just staying in the dyad and just staying in the idea of the individual's perception of the relationship. So I wanted to understand how relationships were developing. But every time I sat down to try to map that out, I'd have a zillion variables that I thought were important. So I would do a box and arrow model, and I think, well, I can't do this because I have 10 variables, and without these variables in there, there's no way I'm going to be able to really get a sense of what's going on. And I will tell you, that's why that's never been done. It's never been done in LMX research, although that's the key area that this should move, because we're constrained by our methods. It's almost impossible for us to put models together using surveys. And beyond that, it's unbelievably difficult to get relationships as they're developing, and as statistical methods have gotten more and more complicated and we need bigger sample sizes, it's really just not viable. So that's why you don't see it. That's why it's not been studied. I think that again, is why we need to move more toward paradigm interplay, but we need to also recognize the constraints on our field by our methods. And I've been talking about this for quite a long time now, but we are bound by methods in a very problematic way, and I think that this is going to change. I know that there's a huge movement toward mixed methods. I worked with John Creswell at the University of Nebraska, and I saw his career take off. He started talking about this in the 1980s, and now he's being invited everywhere to talk about mixed methods. So really, if we stick with the idea of doing a survey approach and only statistical analyses, we're probably not going to get there. We need to start thinking about different kinds of methods. And it doesn't have to be only qualitative. I believe that there are combinations of things that we can do.
Yeah, and so let me just, thinking about my dear colleague, Barbara Kellerman, who we're very good friends and respect each other's work a lot. I would say that the two big insights that she has, or that I remember from her work, are the first one is the notion that, we focus too much on leaders, and what about the other side of the equation? Let's open up and look at followers for a while, and then that created a whole new way of looking at this. However, if you notice, it's still the way that she poses it is as this a dyad. So there's the leaders, and we focus too much on them, and then there's the followers, and let's focus on them some more. But the entry point it continues to be a focus on individuals who are playing particular roles, and then she tries to unpack how the followership role develops and how it connects to the leadership role, right? And so, she's still taking an entity approach, even though she's moving towards the middle of the continuum. The other big insight that I know of her work is when she says, you know, we focus on the normative side of leadership, and we always think of leadership as something that creates good, but what about bad leadership? And that's a whole other area that she unpacks very nicely. But again, she does it from a perspective which she's entering through the leader or the follower from that perspective. Now, contrast that, for example, to the work that we've done at NYU Wagner, where what we did was develop these group interviews with leaders who were leaders and followers and participants of these nonprofit organizations who were trying to change things in their communities because they were working on different problems. And we asked them to tell us stories about when things were happening at their best, when they were doing the work, when their campaigns were having success, when they were able to convince someone at the policy table that they needed to change a law or a regulation. And so we collected lots of stories where there was nothing about leadership. We did not mention the word leadership. We did not ask who was the leader here. We just asked them to tell us how things worked out. And then we analyzed those stories and looked for repeated practices that kept happening over and over and over in the stories that they were talking about, where they have actually realized some kind of collective achievement. And we started to categorize those practices and came with 3 types of leadership practices that help these groups convert their individual efforts into collective achievements. And we labeled them reframing discourse, bridging difference, and unleashing human energies. So you see how different that is from coming from this perspective, from a more traditional perspective, where we would have identified more what are the behaviors and characteristics that people engage in to produce leadership.
And I would also say I want to make sure that I represent Gail Fairhurst and Kevin Barge in the perspective that they bring, which is a communication perspective. I really believe that there's just tremendous opportunity for organizational researchers who are trained more in the kind of background that I am. I've been trained in to look at things like discourse analysis and communication and really dig much deeper, because you can clearly get at leadership and followership when we use communication. All right, we were also asked the question, what's the connection between relational leadership and women in leadership? So this is a funny story. I was contacted by Patricia Warhane and Molly Painter-Moreland because they were doing a book on women in leadership. And they said, we want to use both of your articles, Complexity Leadership and Relational Leadership, and put them in the book and have you comment on them. And so I met with them. I said, well, I don't get it. Why are you using this? I didn't write on women in leadership. And they said, well, it's a feminine perspective. And I said, I didn't even know that. So this has been a journey for me to also learn about gender. I don't think it's just about women in leadership. I think it's about gender and gendered approaches. Joyce Fletcher does a fabulous job in the book of talking about that. What I would say is that I think that we have shifted in leadership toward a more feminine discourse, but I don't think we want to or should go all the way there, that we probably have a mixed approach. And so I think that it's a matter of being more inclusive and thinking about gender on a broader perspective. But clearly, this kind of thinking of relationality being in connection brings in more of the feminine than what we've seen in the past.
I do want to say something. Joyce Fletcher's work is fantastic because she is very clear about saying that relationality is not about mothering, that's a bad practice of leadership, right? That relationality is about an approach that emphasizes relationships, connections between people, because these connections are needed in an interdependent world. And that the good practice of relational leadership are practices that focus on the results of the work, of what the group is trying to do, not on trying to make other people feel good about themselves or feel pampered, or, you know. So there's a very important distinction between a gendered approach to leadership and the idea of relationality, which I think is more neutral. Nevertheless, the point is that because in the Western cultures we have overemphasized, and also in post-positivism we have overemphasized the masculine traits and have used those to construct our logics and the logic of our scientific argument. When we bring elements from relationality and constructionism, the more feminine aspects of the discourse become much more apparent. And so what needs to happen is a balance between those two elements. And I can see why people say that a relational approach can is connected to a gendered approach, and at the same time, you have to be careful that you're not confusing the two pieces.
That's right. So, Anita, I know we're up against time. Do you have a final question that you want to ask?
Yes, I do. The question is, how many paradigms will be explored to provide input? Too much, too little? And as you think of the answer for that one, what do you see as the next step to move the paradigmic interplays and dialogue forward?
Wow, that's a great question.
Right. Do you want to go ahead, Sonia?
Can you repeat the beginning of it?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Sure. The question was, how many paradigms will be explored to provide input? Too much, too little, with regard to, and then also, what do you see as the next step for moving the paradigmic interplays and dialogue forward?
So I'm not sure I quite get the first part, but let me speak to the second part for a moment, because I think we are at a moment in time where also practice has moved faster than theory and research, perhaps in part because we've been engaged in these paradigm wars and we're trying to move away from it. But the reality is that people who are doing practice and are trying to do leadership in the world see the interdependencies, see the need for connection, see all these things. And at the same time, we've been all socialized into the heroic view of leadership. So we try to do leadership in a more interdependent, for a more interdependent world, in a more connected world, in a more relational way. And we kind of like very easily revert into heroic models of leadership. So to me, the big next step is to really think, what are the implications, not only for research, but for practice, of putting on these relational lenses. And I actually think that it means for practitioners to ask themselves, what does it mean to be relational? I think it means to look at the world in a different way and therefore be different in the world and engage differently with others in the world. And as a leader, it means thinking of others in a way that's relational. That means, how do I create conditions that help others engage in leadership work, rather than how do I influence them to do what I want them to do? Is how do I create the conditions that allow all of us to make meaning together and create accomplishments that are felt as collective accomplishments.
And what I would say is that Sonia spoke from the practice side. I think from the research side, what we need to do is really train people in philosophy of science. They need to understand these different paradigmatic perspectives. Even if you're not doing it, they need to be trained in it. And unless we adopt a truly scholarly approach to our research, we're going to remain technicians, and we're going to continue to produce more and more knowledge about less and less. So I think that this book is a good first start, but I think that's all it is the first start. We need more people to engage in this kind of dialogue. We need more resources out there for people to better understand multiple paradigms. Okay, so there's obviously some more slides there, but let me go to the last slide. Anita, you want to go ahead? Is this the one you want?
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
I wanted to say that we'd like to bring a close to the questions, and I want to thank Mary and Sonia for taking the time to be with us. It's really been a great dialogue, and this is a very popular webinar for ILA. If you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope that you'll be able to join us for the next one, the next Leadership Perspectives webinar series with Scott Allen, Paige Harbour-Curran, and Marcy Shankman on emotionally intelligent leadership. That will be on Wednesday, December 3rd at 12 o'clock Eastern Time, and we certainly hope that you'll have an opportunity to join us. And I also would like to announce that the call for proposals for our 2015 global conference is now open, and we certainly hope that those of you who have asked about sessions and whether this will be a topic at the conference will consider putting forth a proposal for presentation. At this point, we'll end the webinar, and we thank everyone for attending. Thank you so very much.